Let me preface by acknowledging that nobody is required to like House Targaryen. Moreover, you don't have to like or stan them to talk about them, provided that you make valid points based on the text and genuine investigation, as opposed to complete nonsense. That being said, basing your entire understanding of the story around hating the Targaryens will inevitably result in that complete nonsense, because Targaryens are not the designated villains of this story, in spite of what it may seem by the discussions around them, where they will often be reduced to their alleged ontological rot. That mindset broadly manifests itself in two ways. The openly hostile one, with the accusations of Targaryens' engagement in colonialism, white supremacy, imperialism, and feudalism. But there's also the slightly more benevolent and poetic one, where rather than to accuse the Targaryens of such horrific crimes, people talk about some inherent tragedy, inherent rot, the dragon eating its own tail as a metaphor for the house's supposed inclination towards self-destruction. Whichever framework gets used, the underlying assumption is the same. All Targaryens, regardless of their personal vices and virtues, are the villains of this story, and any possible peace and end to oppression and misery can be achieved only if they are eradicated off the face of the earth. Even if, and maybe especially, the eradication of Daenerys Targaryen, even if she is benevolently presented as the antithesis of her house. I think it's best exemplified by this post, originally posted on Tumblr, but reposted on Twitter with staggering 18,000 likes. House Targaryen is so rotten. There's nothing new for them. Every second son lives in his brother's shadow. Every first son doomed to the throne that never stops cutting him. Every daughter just a walking womb to bring about another generation of dead babies. The incest as a metaphor for its cannibalizing of itself. It's the dragon eating its tail. They were meant to have died in Valyria. Now live on this wannabe with every member craving for the days of old, the home which they have never been and can never reach. They have to kill each other because, with their dragons, they are their only true equals, in companionship and rivalry. I intentionally hit the OP because I don't want to frame this video as a response to this person specifically. Rather, I use it as proof that, yes, this mindset very much exists and is very much replicated and accepted. I don't want any of my viewers to go and find this post to argue with it either. Please assume that this is solely me using it as an example of a specific mindset, and forget about it immediately after we're done, okay? Do I disagree with this post? Yes and no. It certainly raises issues well present in the text, but the mistake it makes is by making it seem like this description could only be applied to this one house, as opposed to broader cycles within feudalism. And also, some things about it are just wrong. So the questions I will try to answer in this video are as follows. Is House Targaryen rotten? Are they the villains of this story? Were they meant to die in Valyria? And, most importantly, is Queen Daenerys Targaryen, the first of her name, the antithesis of her house, or the embodiment of its very worst? Before we start, remember that if you like my content, like, subscribe and share, so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video. Also, you can listen to this on Spotify if you prefer. Check the link in the description. The first mistake people make when engaging with A Song of Ice and Fire is to assume that Westerosi houses are like Hogwarts houses. Harry Potter had a magical hat that sorted you into one of 4 groups based on your defining personality traits. Bravery is Gryffindor, Intelligence is Ravenclaw, Kindness is Hufflepuff, and Slytherin is a house of magical Nazis. The little nuance concerning these is because Harry Potter is a children's book, which is why it always baffled me how many people were outraged over how little nuance the Nazi blood purity house had. But whatever, we're not here to talk about it, read another book. But houses of Westeros are not boarding school houses. They are families that do have some defining characteristics. Take, for instance, the scientifically inaccurate genetics that have these houses retain their physical appearance even if the genes are recessive. But fundamentally, the mistake made here is to think that a certain house has a certain set of characteristics that go beyond appearance and that those are inherent. Take, for instance, showrunners DBY saying that
there's a Targaryen ruthlessness that comes with even the good Targaryens.
If there are certain characteristics these houses have, those are not biological, but rather cultural. They are all influenced by the dominant feudal culture, but also the region they come from. So the northern houses will put emphasis on resilience and strength because the harsh winters force them to adopt such an approach. The dominant religion, being that of the old gods, will also influence their outlook on life. There are also misconceptions about those. For instance, people are under the impression that Starks are always good and honorable because their perception of the house is influenced by Ned, who himself was raised by an Arryn, whose house motto is as high as honor. The archetypal Stark is more like Brandon or the Kings of Winter. The second mistake is to precisely ascribe inherent virtue or inherent rot to one singular family, because this isn't how George R.R. Martin constructed his story and his characters. The Targaryens have heavily interbred, like the Ptolemies of Egypt. As any horse or dog breeder can tell you, interbreeding accentuates both flaws and virtues and pushes a lineage towards the extremes. Also, there's sometimes a fine line between madness and greatness. Daeron I, the boy king who led a war of conquest, and even the saintly Baelor I, could also be considered mad, if seen in a different light. And I must confess, I love great characters, and those who can be interpreted in many different ways. Both as a reader and a writer, I want complexity and subtlety in my fiction. And with that we could conclude. House Targaryen is neither inherently rotten nor inherently virtuous, and the dichotomy of madness and greatness is often a matter of perspective anyway. The house as a whole was constructed around people of grey morality, because that's what most human beings are. I like great characters. Fantasy for too long has been focused on very stereotypical heroes and villains. And when I look around, I don't see pure white shining heroes and absolutely black villains. I see a lot of flawed human beings who have it in them to be heroes or villains. It's a matter of the choices they make in crucial periods in their lives, in moments of stress and emotional turmoil. To ascribe inherent virtue or inherent rot to any house of Westeros is to betray a fundamental misunderstanding of moral greyness in George R.R. Martin's framework. After all, Martin's favorite historical Targaryen is none other than the rogue prince himself. Over the centuries, House Targaryen has produced both great men and monsters. Prince Daemon was both. In his day there was not a man so admired, so beloved, and so reviled in all Westeros. He was made of light and darkness in equal parts. To some he was a hero, to others the blackest of villains.
You know, I'm notorious for my love of grey characters. And one of the greyest characters in the entire history of Westeros is Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince. He's a notorious bad boy, a rogue in every sense of the word. He switches sides several times. You never know what side he's going to come down on. He's a very colorful and unpredictable character, and I think he has to rank up there as my favorite.
And it is the house as a whole, being morally grey, that makes George fascinated by them. Fire and blood does sound like a good time. As Martin points out, the Targaryens make for uniquely interesting subjects. They're distinctly different from every other Westerosi family, he said. They're kings. They're practicing incest, like the ancient Egyptians, to try to keep the bloodline pure. And they have the dragons, which nobody else has. You can never go wrong with a dragon. So sure, I could do a book about what was happening with the Tyrells at Highgarden, but I don't think it would be as juicy. Songs fans often talk about how they follow George's love for grey characters, but that is simply a lie. If that were the case, characters and houses of Westeros wouldn't have been placed into the biologically, ontologically evil or biologically, ontologically good, and that is something that happens frequently. I imagine that one of the reasons for that is Robert's rebellion, where many houses united against House Targaryen, and that might have led to the incorrect assumption that the Targaryens are and have always meant to be the designated villains, with, once more, ascribing some inherent virtue to the side of the rebels, where the rebellion was much more complicated than that. It sometimes reaches a point where the crimes of the rebels are blamed on the Targaryens. For example, the murder of Elia and her children is blamed on Rhaegar, as opposed to Tywin Lannister, who gave the order, and Robert Baratheon, whose reaction upon seeing their corpses was to say, "I see no children, only dragon spawn." Whether you like it or not, houses of Westeros are feudal houses. All of them. Yes, even the Starks. All of them oppress their serfs, and none of them reach the influence and power they have by being democratically elected. Yes, even the Starks. Maybe especially the Starks. Song and story tell us that the Starks of Winterfell have ruled large portions of the lands beyond the Neck for 8,000 years, styling themselves the Kings of Winter, the more ancient usage, and, in more recent centuries, the Kings in the North. The rule was not an uncontested one. Many were the wars in which the Starks expanded their rule or were forced to win back lands that rebels had carved away. The Kings of Winter were hard men in hard times. Ancient ballads, amongst the oldest to be found in the archives of the citadel of Old Town, tell of how one King of Winter drove the giants from the north, whilst another felled the skin changer, Gaven Greywolf, and his kin in the savage war of the wolves. But we have only the word of singers that such kings and such battles ever existed. More historical proof exists for the war between the Kings of Winter and the Barrow Kings to their south, who styled themselves the Kings of the First Men and claimed supremacy over all First Men everywhere, even the Starks themselves. Runic records suggest that their struggle, dubbed the 1,000 Years' War by the singers, was actually a series of wars that lasted closer to 200 years than 1,000, ending when the last Barrow King bent his knee to the King of Winter and gave him the hand of his daughter in marriage. Even this did not give Winterfell dominion over all the north. Many other petty kings remained, ruling over realms great and small, and it would require thousands of years and many more wars before the last of them was conquered. Yet one by one, the Starks subdued them all, and during these struggles, many proud houses and ancient lines were extinguished forever. Chronicles found in the archives of the Night's Watch at the Nightfort, before it was abandoned, speak of the war for Sea Dragon Point, wherein the Starks brought down the Warg King and his inhuman allies, the Children of the Forest. When the Warg King's last redoubt fell, his sons were put to the sword, along with his beasts and Greenseers, whilst his daughters were taken as prizes by their conquerors. The enmity between the Starks and Boltons went back to the Long Night itself, it is claimed. Yet in the end, even the Dreadfort fell before the might of Winterfell, and the last Red King, known to history as Rogar the Huntsman, swore fealty to the King of Winter, and sent his sons to Winterfell as hostages, even as the first Andals were crossing the narrow sea in their longships. On the brows they were stone crows. Torrhen Stark, the King who knelt, Edwin the Spring King, Theon Stark the Hungry Wolf, Brandon the Burner and Brandon the Shipwright, Jorah and Jonas, Brandon the Bat, Walton the Moon King, Ederion the Bridegroom, Aerion, Benjen the Sweet and Benjen the Bitter, King Edric Snowbird. Their faces were stern and strong, and some of them had done terrible things. But they were Starks, every one, and Bran knew all their tales. He had never feared the crypts. They were part of his home and who he was, and he had always known that one day he would lie here too. Not to mention that the Starks, as first men, worked with the Children of the Forest and participated in their genocide and stealing their ancestral lands. Thousands entered and began to settle the lands, and as the decades passed, they pushed farther and farther north. Such tales as we have of those migratory days are not to be trusted, for they suggest that, within a few short years, the first men had moved beyond the Neck and into the north. Yet, in truth, it would have taken decades, even centuries, for this to occur. What does seem to be accurate from all details, however, is that the first men soon came to war with the Children of the Forest. Unlike the Children, the first men farmed the land and raised up ringforts and villages. And in so doing, they took to chopping down the weirwood trees, including those with carved faces, and for this, the Children attacked them, leading to hundreds of years of war. The first men, who had brought with them strange gods, horses, cattle, and weapons of bronze, were also larger and stronger than the Children, and so they were a significant threat. The hunters among the Children, their wood dancers, became their warriors as well. But for all their secret arts of tree and leaf, they could only slow the first men in their advance. Regardless, the children of the forest fought as fiercely as the first men to defend their lives. Inexplorably, the war ground on across generations, until at last the children understood that they could not win. The first men, perhaps tired of war, also wished to see an end to the fighting. The wisest of both races prevailed, and the chief heroes of rulers of both sides met upon the Isle of the God's Eye to form the pact. Giving up all the lands of Westeros, save for the deep forests, the children won from the first men the promise that they would no longer cut down the weirwoods. Nymeria also worked with the Dornish to establish her dominance over the region. Such supremacy was easier to declare than to achieve, however. Years of war followed, as the Martells and the Rhoynar partners met and subdued one petty king after another. No fewer than 6 conquered kings were sent to the wall in golden feathers by Nymeria and her prince, until only the greatest of their foes remained. Yorick Ironwood, the Blood Royal, 5th of his name, Lord of Ironwood, Warden of the Stoneway, Knight of the Wells, King of Red March, King of the Greenbelt, and King of the Dornish. Though she married twice more, first to the aged Lord Ular of Hellholt, and later to the dashing Sir Davos Dain of Starfall, the Sword of the Morning, Nymeria herself remained the unquestioned ruler of Dorne for almost 27 years, her husband serving only as counselors and consorts. She survived a dozen attempts upon her life, put down 2 rebellions, and threw back 2 invasions by the Storm King Duran III and one by King Graydon of the Reach. Often, the discussions around Targaryens single them out as unique in their use of conquest and war to subdue the kingdoms they wished to rule. But we see that this isn't the case. The great houses of Westeros became great houses and kings in their own right by the same means as them. That is because they are all feudal houses and not democratically elected Soviet councils. Having knowledge of the lore, where it's made abundantly clear that the Targaryens are not the only ones to engage in conquest, war, and even atrocities, why are the Targaryens treated like the song's version of Slytherin? The most immediately apparent reason is that George has written more supplementary materials to Targaryens than to any other house. We see their highs, their lows, their good kings, their bad kings, and their unremarkable kings, the mad Targaryens and the great ones, the ones who were both and those who were neither. We don't have that for any other house. If you had an entire book dedicated to the fates of the ruling monarchs, as opposed to a few short sentences about how the first men took half of the Singer's lands after a relentless genocide, and the kings of winter extinguishing entire bloodlines and warring for centuries, then of course the Targaryens will seem worse by comparison, no matter the actual state of things. Especially because for many people, The World of Ice and Fire isn't considered a mandatory read, whereas Fire and Blood is. In Fire and Blood itself, the narrative of the Dance of the Dragons gets the most spotlight, and since it was such a devastating conflict, it overshadows everything that came before and even after that. For instance, the immediate long-term period of peace following the conquest, that the continent was previously not familiar with, as well as the long era of peace and prosperity under Jaehaerys and Alysanne. Jaehaerys' and Alysaine's accomplishments in particular were both spectacular and long overdue. Westeros existed for thousands of years, but it was their rule that introduced the citizens to stable roads, clean water, codified laws, and standardized taxes. With the way I see the dynasty is discussed, it's made to seem like everything was great until the Targaryens attacked, when it's demonstrably not the case. I would go as far as to say that the unification of the kingdom and the reforms by Jaehaerys and Alysanne alone made the dynasty a net positive for the continent. Much the same will happen if you ignore supplementary material and only read the main series, since a strong focus of the current generation is Robert's Rebellion and its repercussions for the kingdom. That too will contribute to the perception that the Targaryens are uniquely evil and villainous, because most of your understanding of past Targaryen kings will be influenced by Aerys Targaryen. The crucial insights of everything and everyone that came before him, the good, the bad, and the unremarkable, will also be omitted and not taken into account. And the rebellion itself in particular gets the Avengers Unite treatment, irrespective of the fact that for many participants, it wasn't really about justice or accountability for the tyrannical king, but simple personal interest. Look no further than at the fact that the Tyrells turned from loyalists to rebels when all was settled. Or at the fact that mere 6 years after the rebellion, the Greyjoys, who did back the Baratheons during the rebellion, albeit very late in the game, decided to rebel themselves. Part of the reason as to why Balon even decided to rebel was because he believed Robert will not be supported as a usurper, proving that the Targaryens were a stabilizing factor to the kingdom for a very long time. A crucial thing to understand is that houses of Westeros rarely go to war and choose sides in wars, due to what is right and honorable, but according to what is the most beneficial to their feudal interests, which is why the Tyrells turned cloaks the moment it was beneficial to them, why Tywin only joined the rebels when he was sure of their victory, why Balon rebelled against the same man his father supported, why Stannis and Renly, two brothers who lived through the rebellion, turned against each other at the onset of the War of the Five Kings, and so on and so forth. These houses rarely, if ever, use their moral or ethical judgments or past sympathies when making these choices, but take into account what serves them personally. Therefore, even the nominally justified rebellion should not be perceived as some democratic uprising. As demonstrated before, Targaryens have more supplementary material written about them than any other house. The bulk of the World of Ice and Fire is about the dynasty, and there is also Fire and Blood. And all of that plainly because the author finds them more interesting than other houses. Not to mention that it was the Targaryen prequels that were greenlit by HBO, House of the Dragon, as well as the Conquest series currently in development. That must certainly lead to some plain old jealousy in the fans of other houses, especially when coupled with the general disdain towards the Targaryens. Such a state of things is doomed to cause some cognitive dissonance. If these Targaryens are so ontologically evil and violent, why is the author, the fans, and the TV network giving them the attention that they are unworthy of? Many people cope with this cognitive dissonance precisely by insinuating that George is playing some 5D chess with us, only writing about them to condemn them and make them seem like the ontologically rotten people that the true heroes of the story must defeat, rather than what he describes in much simpler terms. Uniquely interesting subjects, characterized by their general moral grayness and nuances. These are the reasons I find most immediately apparent, and there are also some more subconscious ones. For instance, that the Targaryens are associated with the things Western audiences see as evil. Like the house as a whole, fans refuse to see the nuance of dragons, how depending on whose hands they are in, they may be used for evil or for good. The Valyrians used dragons to enslave, Daenerys uses her dragons to liberate, and even Aegon the Conqueror used his dragons to bring unity, to demonstrably positive results. Aegon's chief concern was peace. Before the conquest, wars between the realms of Westeros were common. Hardly a year passed without someone fighting someone somewhere. Even in those kingdoms said to be at peace, neighboring lords oft settled their disputes at sword point. Aegon's ascension put an end to much of that. Petty lords and landed knights were now expected to take their disputes to their liege lords and abide by their judgments. Arguments between the great houses of the realm were adjudicated by the crown. The first law of the land shall be the king's peace, King Aegon declared. And any lord who goes to war without my leave shall be considered a rebel and an enemy of the Iron Throne. We also know that this wasn't just a power grab on behalf of Aegon. That actually came from Martin. He told us very early on in the room, just as he does, just casually mentioning the fact that Aegon the Conqueror was a dreamer who saw a vision of the White Walkers coming across the wall and sweeping over the land with cold and darkness. So, with his permission, of course, we infused that into the story because it was such a great way to create resonance with the original show. Just like the appeals to moral grayness fall flat when ascribing inherent wrath to the Targaryens due to their overall moral grayness, so does the perception of dragons in the fandom become one-dimensional. The nukes argument. And that happens to fall perfectly in line with the straightforward perception of dragons in Western fantasy. Again, if you think that Songs fans like subversions, this is proof that they don't, because they buy verbatim into Western canon's perception of these magnificent creatures. Western dragons have traditionally been a symbol of evil. A typical Western dragon can fly and breathe fire. Many legends describe dragons as greedy, keeping hoards of gold and other precious treasure. In myths and folklore, dragons were monsters to be conquered. As dragons may be seen to represent the dark side of humanity, including greed, lust, and violence, the conquest of a dragon represents the confrontation and extinguishment of those evil instincts. That is in stark contrast to how the dragons are perceived in the East. The Chinese dragon is a symbol of wisdom, power, and luck in Chinese culture. Unlike Western dragons, Oriental dragons are usually seen as benevolent and kind. Dragons have long been a symbol in Chinese folklore and art. Temples and shrines have been built to honor them. Through the symbol of the dragon, many Chinese see divine attributes which they aspire to themselves. In fact, the Chinese are sometimes referred to as descendants of the dragon. The dragon is held in reverence and respect in Chinese culture. There's also some interesting pattern here in which the Targaryens, and particularly Daenerys, are considered unworthy of their dragons, demonstrated by the popular theories about how someone will steal the dragons from Dany, in which case they will magically not be weapons of mass destruction. That again is just jealousy. Songs fans actually hate the fact that the dragons are in the hands of someone they see as unworthy of them. I can guarantee you that if the Starks had dragons, we wouldn't be having these conversations. And that irrespective of the fact that currently, dragons are linked to liberation from slavery. And when a man in a blue and gold tokar began to speak of Harkas the hero, a freedman behind him shoved him on the floor. It took 6 brazen beasts to pull them apart and drag them from the hole. Targaryens are also associated with another thing that Western people tend to see as evil: fire. Just like with dragons, the Western audiences will overwhelmingly associate fire with negatives: destruction, pain, suffering. That is a very reductive perception, for fire embodies far more than just that. As a gift of the gods, the source of light and heat, it conditions the sphere of well-being, of life, and of the divine and celestial world. At the same time, as a destructive force, it enters organically into the chaotic and infernal aspects of this world and the next. Prometheus, in stealing fire from heaven, undoubtedly did not think of this destructive side of fire. However, the two forms of fire interpenetrate. The anger of the god of heaven is armed with lightning. His divine majesty is surrounded by an awe-inspiring fire. On the other hand, the violence of devouring fire is not merely negative, for fire can purify, renew, and rejuvenate. Agni is the Hindu god of fire. He is regarded as the friend and protector of humanity. In particular, he safeguards the home. Various forms of fire are associated with Agni and include the sun, lightning, comets, sacrificial fire, domestic fires, the fire of the funeral pyre, and the digestive fire, which is within all humans. Zoroastrians have a particularly strong relationship with fire, which they see as a focus for ritual and contemplation. The ancient flames they tend are called Atash Bahrams, which means victorious fire. The fires are not worshipped, but when standing nearby, believers feel they are in the presence of the deity Ahura Mazda. The flame can be symbolic of various things, expressing inspiration, compassion, the truth, devotion, as well as continuity and change. It's worth noting that the religion of the Red God was inspired by Zoroastrianism, sharing the common attribute of the eternal struggle between the embodiment of light and benevolence, Ahura Mazda, and the embodiment of evil, Angra Mainyu. Much like R'hllor eternally battles against the Great Order. Like R'hllor, Ahura Mazda is associated with fire, and as such, this element has a particular importance in the religion. Interestingly, Song's fans often deride the R'hllor's religion as uniquely barbaric and its followers as uniquely prone to fanaticism. If you ever see people claim that George criticized religious fundamentalism, you can be sure that it will be mostly the religion of R'hllor that gets these accusations. Even though by far the strongest condemnation of religious fanaticism that I myself see in the books is the criticism of the faith, which is clearly based on Western Catholicism. And given that George was raised Catholic and not Zoroastrian, I feel like criticizing his own religion would be more appropriate and likely. But even with all that in mind, it has to be highlighted that even Christianity sees fire as positive in certain instances. Fire, as theophany of existence, communicates, first of all, the very presence of God. This is especially evident in the burning bush from which God spoke to Moses. Here fire is a manifestation of God himself, for Moses turned away from the sight because he was afraid to look at God. Similar to this is Yahweh's descent upon Mount Sinai in fire. Fire as theophany of action reveals God at work in a number of ways. One of the earliest and clearest of these ways is his appearance in a pillar of fire that led the people of Israel out of Egypt and through the Sinai deserts. Another instance of God's use of fire as an active manifestation of his presence is his sending fire from heaven to consume sacrifices offered up to him on special and unusual occasions. Asked about the title of his epic saga, George himself had this to say: "Fire is love. Fire is passion. Fire is sexual ardor, and all of these things. By the way people talk about fire in relation to song, you could get the impression like the text presents fire as solely a source of distraction, even though just as often it is presented as a source of life, hope, strength, and healing. To name a few examples. Yet when she slept that night, she dreamt the dragon dream again. Viserys was not in it this time. There was only her and the dragon. Its scales were black as night, wet and slick with blood. Her blood, Dany sensed. Its eyes were pools of molten magma, and when it opened its mouth, the flame came roaring out in a hot jet. She could hear it singing to her. She opened her arms to the fire, embraced it, let it swallow her whole, let it cleanse her and temper her and score her clean. She could feel her flesh sear and blacken and slot away, could feel her blood boil and turn to steam, and yet there was no pain. She felt strong and new and fierce. I made him a poultice of fire pot and sting me not, and bound it in a lambskin. It burned, he said. He tore it off. The herb women made him a new one, wet and soothing. It burned, yes. There is great healing magic in fire. Even your hairless men know that. The one-dimensional view of fire and dragons is radiated by the equally one-dimensional view of the Targaryens' housewords. Fire and blood. Fire and blood is most often associated with close to senseless violence, blood spilled with fire, rather than, again, something with nuance. In the World of Ice and Fire, we are told that the Valyrian magic was rooted in blood and fire, therefore, it has more than one meaning. See, the repeated pattern here seems to be the absolute disdain towards nuance, in spite of the fact that George is so obsessed with nuance that it can sometimes become annoying. And since fans of A Song of Ice and Fire are often weirdly anti-magic, and in particular anti-Valyrian and fire magic, the cycle completes. After all, fire is scary and Thomas Edison was a witch. I have long debated whether I should make this connection, but the evidence to it is all too damning to just be left at that. It is an undeniable fact that the Targaryens are distinctly different from other houses of Westeros, having been based on ancient Egyptians, while other Westerosi houses are decidedly more Western European. They physically come from the East, from a decidedly Eastern civilization of Valyria, and have strong associations with things the Western world denotes as evil, fire and dragons. Therefore, the less overt reason why the Targaryens are denoted as particularly evil is that they are the other from the scary East. Westerosi themselves do display deeply xenophobic behaviors towards those from the Eastern continent. All this the court and kingdom might have come to accept in time had Lady Lara not also insisted upon keeping her own gods. She would have no part in the worship of the Seven, nor the old gods of the Northmen. Her worship was reserved for certain of the manifold gods of Lys, the six-breasted cat goddess Panthera, angels of the twilight, who was male by day and female by night, the pale child Bacalon of the sword, faced Sagael, the giver of pain. Her ladies, her servants, and her guards would join Lady Lara at certain times in performing obeisances to these queer, ancient deities. Cats were seen coming and going from her chambers so often that men began to say that they were her spies, pouring at her in soft voices of all the doings of the Red Keep. It was even said that Lara herself could transform into a cat, to prowl the gutters and rooftops of the city. Darker rumors soon arose. The acolytes of Indros could supposedly transform themselves from male to female and female to male through the act of love, and whispers went about that her ladyship oft availed herself of this ability at twilight orgies, so she might visit the brothels of the Street of Silk as a man. And every time a child went missing, the ignorant would look at one another and talk of Sagael's insatiable thirst for blood. By the end of 134 AC, some feared they might soon rule Westeros as well. Their pride and pomp and power became the talk of King's Landing. Men began to whisper of their wiles. Loto bought men with gold, Rogaria seduced them with perfumed flesh, Moredo frightened them into submission with steel. Yet the brothers were no more than puppies in the hands of Lady Lara. It was her and her queer Lysian gods who held their strings. The king, the little queen, the young prince. They were only children, blind to what was happening about them, whilst the king's guard and the gold cloaks and even the king's hand had been bought and sold. Or so these stories went. Like all such tales, they had some truth to them, well mixed with fear and falsehood. That the Lyseni were proud, grasping, and ambitious cannot be doubted. That Loto used his bank and Rogerio his brothel to win friends to their cause goes without saying. Yet in the end they differed but little from many of the other lords and ladies of Aegon III's court, all of them pursuing power and wealth in their own ways. Though more successful than their rivals, for a time at least, the Lyseni were only one of several factions competing for influence. Had Lady Lara and her brothers been Westerosi, they might have been admired and celebrated, but their foreign birth, foreign ways, and foreign gods made them objects of mistrust and suspicion instead. The mostly Western readers of this story probably have internalized these disdainful perceptions of the East as something weird and scary, as does George R. R. Martin himself, particularly in his lack of care in constructing the Dothraki. In his case, that seems mostly like ignorance, but many of the fans of the saga express those views with malice. Even if Valyria seems to be more Rome-inspired than anything, the disdain towards dragons and fire, the concept that are met with suspicion by the West, are a dead giveaway. Some people are better at hiding it with smokescreens, the usual appeals to Nazism, imperialism or colonization, but that is undermined every time the less optics-focused fans call Aegon the Conqueror a foreign invader. Or maybe even more tellingly, Daenerys, who herself was born in Westeros, being called a potential foreign invader, with an evil army of Eastern multicultural and multi-ethnic people. Some people go as far as to say that her madness will come about by the rejection of Westerosi, rooted in xenophobia and racism, thus validating this very xenophobia and racism. Certainly helps that her second-to-last scene in the show had her deliver a fascist speech in scary foreign languages to her multi-ethnic and multicultural army, one that the show reduced to mindless savages, no less. A small side note that I feel is worth including. In the show, the leading instrument accompanying Targaryen themes is the Armenian duduk, and someone once told me that Targaryen sounds like an Armenian last name. I'm pretty sure it wasn't intentional on behalf of George, but it really does. If you put it next to Tarkanian, Tsarukian or Torosian, it doesn't look out of place at all. The last cultural connotations I want to tackle is the dragon eating its own tail. I saw this particular invocation not only in the post I quoted in the beginning, but in other places as well. The depictions of the Targaryen sigil that I've seen do have a dragon eating its own tail, and on the surface it seems like a very straightforward imagery of self-destruction, but this isn't what the symbol actually means. Ouroboros, emblematic serpent of ancient Egypt and Greece, represented with its tail in its mouth, continually devouring itself and being reborn from itself. Agnostic and alchemical symbol, Ouroboros expresses the unity of all things, material and spiritual, which never disappear, but perpetually change form in an eternal cycle of destruction and recreation. I have said at the beginning that I really don't care if you don't like the Targaryens, are not interested in them, or even find them morally reprehensible. The problem I have and always had was the hypocrisy in acting morally superior for disliking them, while stunning houses that also perpetuate misogyny and oppression, as well as basing your entire understanding of the story on the assumption that they are uniquely evil and rotten villains, while placing other houses as the ontologically virtuous heroes. At the end of the day, all of them are the same, and all of them have their skeletons in the closet. And that really shouldn't matter to us at all. We read this story because we enjoy it. You don't have to shake your head while reading the books to make everyone know that you disapprove of feudalism. That is a reasonable position that shouldn't warrant any external verbalization. But the problem that we consistently encounter is precisely that. Targaryens are singled out as the only feudal house, and that warrants complete distraction, all in the same breath as cheering for the Starks to be an independent kingdom, and not a republic, and the insistence that the Targaryens, and particularly Daenerys, must atone for their past crimes with death, while others get scot-free of the same crimes. The post I quoted in the beginning is emblematic of this very perception. It is broadly correct, only it makes a mistake of assuming that the Targaryens are uniquely subjected to these toxic cycles, as opposed to it being cycles present in broader feudalism. We will start with the incest. It is undeniable that the Targaryens were marrying their closest family members, but what may surprise you is that, if you look at the entire history, they intermarried with other Westerosi houses far more than they did with each other. 10 sibling marriages were recorded, and far more Targaryens married houses descending from the First Men and the Andals, like Alicent and Viserys, Egg and Betha, Daeron and Miriah, to name a few examples. In contrast, the Starks married someone of non-First Man blood only once, and it caused a scandal. Even Robb tries to justify his marriage to Jane Westerling on the basis of blood quality. I am not a fan of incest, and I really don't want to talk about incest, but I also think that this issue is blown out of proportion. I don't think that Targaryen incest is meant to be some metaphor for anything, much less for the house's biological wiring towards self-destruction. I have certain suspicions as to why incest is such a prevalent theme in this story, especially when you look at the initial drafts that had Jon and Arya fall in love, and George going on Twitter to call Alysanne and Jaehaerys a great love story. And frankly, if you need him to look you in the eye and say, hey, incest is bad and there has to be narrative punishment for the incest-practicing family, then that's on you. We have already established that George isn't the type of writer to hold your hand and guide you through the answers, nor is he particularly moralistic in his story. And while indeed the Targaryens were the only family to openly practice sibling incest, Ned's parents were first cousins, as were the parents of Jaime, Tyrion and Cersei. That too is incest. Either you're against all incest or none. When reading A Song of Ice and Fire and more recently Fire and Blood, I never had an impression that the Targaryens particularly long for Valyria, which is why it surprised me that so many people seem to insinuate that they do, and that they want to either embody Valyria or impose Valyrian culture and customs on the land they conquered. I, in fact, had the opposite impression, that the Targaryens were becoming more and more Westerosi with each passing generation. Let's start with the claim that they were not supposed to make it out of Valyria in the first place. If so, why did they make it out? Why did Daenis the Dreamer have a vision of the destruction of this civilization 12 years before it happened? Why did Aenar the Exile listen to his daughter's warnings, and why were they the only Dragon Lords to survive? I see no evidence to support this claim, and I see all the evidence to the contrary. This seems like a poetic way to make a claim that Targaryens don't have a place in the narrative, and more importantly, do not have a place in Westeros. Targaryens never enforced their Valyrian ways on Westerosi. They were the ones to assimilate into the dominant culture and religion of the region. Valyrians did not have monarchy. Valyrians did not worship the Seven. And right after they assimilate into the Westerosi ways, their self-destruction starts. Because it's not Valyrian customs that cause their self-destruction, but Westerosi ones. For what little we know about Valyria, it seems like Valyrian women held much more power and authority than Westerosi women. At their height before the Doom, other cities such as Mantaris, Volontaris, Oros, Tyria, Draconis, Illyria, Mysafair, Rios, and Akos Daen were grand and glorious and rich. Yet for all their pride and power, none ever ruled itself. They were governed by men and women sent out from Valyria to govern in the name of the freehold. From this short passage, we learn a lot. That some women were ruling these places in the name of the freehold. Thus, they were not entirely excluded from power in their own right, the way Westerosi women are. This is also consistent with how Aegon treated his two queens, who were his equal partners in ruling and conquest. Visenya, eldest of the three siblings, was as much a warrior as Aegon himself, as comfortable in ringmail as in silk. She carried the Valyrian longsword Dark Sister, and was skilled in its use, having trained beside her brother since childhood. Dark Sister was made for a woman's hand. This ancestral weapon must have been forged in Valyria, meaning that she was likely wielded by women before Visenya. Coupled with the lack of information of Visenya facing obstacles in her pursuit of being a warrior, it seems reasonable to assume that it wasn't out of ordinary for Valyrian women to be martially trained. Rhaenys herself was not a warrior, yet she commanded armies and rode a dragon like Visenya, meaning that she was also able to learn in the arts of war. This leads me to believe that this was a standard practice in Valyria. But we never had another Rhaenys and Visenya. Jaehaerys and Alysanne were only their grandchildren, and yet Jaehaerys never granted Alysanne the same treatment as Aegon did to his queens. As much influence as Alysanne wielded, she never sat the throne nor held any official position in Jaehaerys' council. Visenya and Rhaenys only gave birth to one child each, but Jaehaerys unleashed reproductive abuse on his wife. Bearing and delivering a child might be a joy for a young woman of 10 and 7, like the Princess Alyssa, but it is quite another matter for one of 40, like her mother, Queen Alysanne. The joy was therefore not entirely unalloyed when Her Grace was found to be pregnant once again. Prince Valerian was born in 77 AC, after another troubled labor that saw Alezane confined to her bed for half a year. Like his brother Gam-Ol 4 years earlier, he was a small and sickly babe, and never thrived. Half a dozen wet nurses came and went to no avail. In 78 AC, Valerian died, a fortnight short of his first name day. The queen took his passing with resignation. "I am 42 years old," she told the king. "You must be content with the children I have given you. I am more suited to be a grandmother than a mother now, I fear." King Jaehaerys did not share her certainty. "Our mother, Queen Alyssa, was 46 when she gave birth to Jocelyn," he pointed out to Grandmaster Elissar. "The gods might not be done with us." Valerian was Alezane's 12th child, by the way. And, just to remind you, this is what happened to Alyssa Valerian. Lord Rogar, we are told, could not bear to look upon his wife, nor could he find the words until the king took him roughly by the arm and shook him. "Save my son," Rogar told the Maester. Then he wrenched free and fled the room again. Maester Kyrie bowed his head and sent for his blades. In many of the accounts that have come down to us, we are told that Queen Alyssa woke from her sleep before the Maester could begin. Though racked by pain and violent convulsions, she cried tears of joy to see her children there. When Alezane told her what was about to happen, Alyssa gave her assent. "Save my babe," she whispered. "I will go to see my boys again. The crown will light my way." It is pleasant to believe these were the queen's last words. Sad to say, other accounts tell us that Her Grace died without waking when Maester Kyrie opened her belly. On one point all agree. Alezane held her mother's hand in her own from start to finish, until the babe's first squall filled the room. This passage proves that the Targaryens were not at all unique in viewing women as walking wombs. The treatment of Targaryen women as walking wombs happened precisely because they began assimilating into the dominant feudal culture of Westeros. In feudalism, all women are treated like that, because feudalism relies on the birth of male heirs, as seen with Rogar's wish to save his son. And only a few generations after Rhaenys and Visenya, Rhaenyra was murdered for the crime of being her father's chosen heir as a woman. And after Rhaenyra, Baelor's sisters were imprisoned in the Maiden Vault, and Nerys and Rhaella reduced to these walking wombs. But the Targaryens were never unique in that, nor did they bring this treatment to Westeros. The opposite happened. And with the Duns in particular, often I hear about how these damn Targaryens brought their downfall on themselves and killed all their dragons for no reason. They act like this war happened because they wanted to destroy themselves, or were too stupid to realize what they're doing, and not that there was interference from the dominant Andal law-following culture. The Targaryens themselves went to war not because they're biologically wired towards self-destruction like it is claimed. They went to war because Targaryen men found it more beneficial to keep their women subjugated, and that came from them not emulating Valerians, but from them becoming more and more Westerosi. But admitting that this was not something inherent to the Targaryens would mean that there is something wrong with the Westerosi culture at large. Meaning it wasn't the scary Eastern civilization, the archetypal other, that brought misogyny to the continent. Meaning other houses are guilty of the very same crimes. And we can't have that. After all, Westeros is a good Western civilization, based on the noble Western European ideas of knighthood, honor and feudal custom. Thus, it's far easier to argue that somehow it was the Targaryens who brought the treatment of women like walking incubators onto the continent, as opposed to it being wired into the feudal culture they assimilated into. And that would mean that the beloved Western Starks, Hightowers and Lannisters were not standing as a communist vanguard in opposition to evil, feudalistic, oppressive Eastern Targaryens. And that these things will not magically disappear when the Targaryens are destroyed and defeated by the heroes of the story. This is the prime problem I had with the post at the very beginning. Most of the things mentioned there were not exclusive to the Targaryens, nor were they the ones who brought it onto the continent. OP describes cycles within feudalism, not within that singular family, but erroneously ascribes it to Targaryens exclusively. Every single accusation pointed at Targaryens could also be pointed towards Westerosi houses. Incest? Cousin incest is still incest, no matter how you spin it. Starks extinguished entire bloodlines to cement their dominion over the north. Wars? Westeros was in a state of near constant war before unification. Colonialism? Let's ask those who sing the Song of Earth what they think about the theft of their ancestral land. Misogyny? It was the Andal law that favored males in the law of succession, not Valyrian law. Treating women like cattle to be bought and sold in marriages? Let's ask Lysa Tully. Women as walking incubators? Only women dead in childbirth would like a word. Blood purity? The Starks married into a non-first man descending house only once, and it was a scandal. Magical abilities exclusive solely to a certain ethnicity? Let's find an Andal Green Seer or a skin changer. The second son always in the shadow of the eldest one? Brandon and Ned would like a word. And it's still okay to dislike Targaryens or be disinterested in them. Fine by me. It is absolutely none of my business who and what you like in A Song of Ice and Fire. I don't think anyone is required to like this or that house, this or that character. Different things compel different people. The only thing I ask, don't be a hypocrite and get off your high horse. Because your faces are not any better. Daenerys is unique among our POV cast in that she is the last of her dynasty. Most of her family dies before the story starts, her brother dies very early on, and the potential secret Targaryens are either unconfirmed or introduced very late in the game. As such, Daenerys gets all the spotlight as the last scion of her house. This, coupled with all the supplementary material about her family, will inevitably cause people to compare and contrast her with her family members. Broadly, people reach two conclusions about her. One, that she is the embodiment of her house in the most negative sense possible, the narrative parallel to the very worst people the house has ever produced, the likes of Aerys II or Maegor the Cruel. According to the proponents of this framework, she is biologically wired to follow in their footsteps. Mad evil genes flow in her veins, and she is destined to die as a mad queen, preferably on a righteous man's sword. But there is also another camp, the believers of the Dany is an anti-Targaryen framework. Within this group, we can broadly find two subgroups. Genuine Daenerys fans who simply dislike her family as a whole, and the I love Dany bats. I call them that due to the mantra they often invoke when discussing Daenerys. I love Dany, but. I love Dany, but she is a tragic figure. I love Dany, but she is destined to die. I love Dany, but you cannot deny that her destiny is heroic self-sacrifice. I love Dany, but she is a Targaryen. Thus she is wired for destruction. I love Dany, but she is too broken to live and heal. I love Dany, but. I love Dany, but. I love Dany, but. I'm generally sympathetic to the people who claim Dany to be an anti-Targaryen out of a genuine wish to defend her. After all, when you hear about how Targaryens are the worst people ever that brought nothing but destruction to the continent, you'll inevitably want to distance her from them. However misguided that belief is, and not based on the text, as we soon shall see, I do understand this approach, even if I disagree. I have much less patience for the malicious camp and even less for the I love Dany bats. The malicious camp is open about their disdain for Daenerys and the Targaryens, but the I love Dany bats are sneakier and more nebulous, so it's often difficult to combat them. In reality, there is little difference between them. They believe in the same things, but one camp will call Targaryens Nazis and colonizers, while the other will talk about ontological rot and the dragon eating its own tail. Ultimately, the underlying belief they have is that Dany and the Targaryens have no place in the narrative. Their goal is also the same, Dany's and the Targaryens' removal from said narrative, usually coupled with the elevation of other houses and characters as the true heroes of the story. Both insist that being born to House Targaryen is some sort of an original sin that can only be cleansed with death, and the house's subsequent extinction. That irrespective of the fact that so many of the I love Dany bats claim Daenerys to be the antithesis of her house, so logically, it would serve a higher purpose for her to be the herald of change, as opposed to her dying to redeem the sins that aren't even hers, and even though she is the one that actively fights against the legacy of old Valyria. Some of them believe in the Mad Queen Dany theory and believe her to be doomed to succumb to the ontological self-destruction of her house, albeit they insist it will be so super tragic. Others believe that, because of the sins of her family, she will commit some horrible atrocity by accident and die to redeem herself in the long night. But the underlying assumption is always the same. I myself am a secret fourth thing. Targaryens are certainly my favorite house in the entire story, but that is because Daenerys is a Targaryen. I am mostly interested in defending them in relation to Dany, because the bulk of hatred of the Targaryens stems from hate towards Dany. Look no further than at the fact that, with the release of House of the Dragon, Daenerys antis clung onto Alicent, the Hightowers, and the Greens to disparage the Blacks and Rhaenyra. But rest assured, I will throw everyone and everything under the bus for Daenerys if need be. So, is Daenerys the anti-Targaryen? Let me ask my good friend George R.R. Martin. Hello George, I wanted to ask you, is Daenerys an antithesis of her house or its embodiment?
2 hours later.
Right, yeah. Thank you very much, goodbye. Okay, we're done talking. He spent the entire 2 hours talking about, you name it, nuance. What if I told you that she's both of these things at the same time? Daenerys is the best of her house and the antithesis of its very worst. And you know what? The text agrees with me. In times of doubt and fear, Daenerys invokes her heritage to give herself strength. I am blood of the dragon, she told herself. I am Daenerys Stormborn, princess of Dragonstone, of the blood and seed of Aegon the Conqueror. If I were not the blood of the dragon, she thought wistfully, this could be my home. She was Khaleesi, she had a strong man and a swift horse, handmaids to serve her, warriors to keep her safe, an honored place in the Doshkalin awaiting her when she grew old, and in her womb grew a son who would one day bestride the world. That should be enough for any woman, but not for the dragon. With Viserys gone, Daenerys was the last, the very last. She was the seed of kings and conquerors, and so too the child inside her. She must not forget. He must have sensed her fright, for he moved restlessly inside her. Then he stroked the swell of her belly gently, wishing she could reach him, touch him, soothe him. You are the blood of the dragon, little one, she whispered as her littles swayed along, curtains drawn tight. You are the blood of the dragon, and the dragon does not fear. For centuries, Meereen and her sister cities Yunkai and Astapor had been the linchpins of the slave trade, the place where Dothraki Coles and the corsairs of the Basilic Isles sold their captives and the rest of the world came to buy. Without slaves, Meereen had little to offer traders. Copper was plentiful in the Giscari Hills, but the metal was not as valuable as it had been when bronze ruled the world. The cedars that had once grown tall along the coast grew no more, felled by the axes of the old empire or consumed by dragonfire when Ghis made war against Valyria. Once the trees had gone, the soil baked beneath the hot sun and blew away in thick red clouds. It was these calamities that transformed my people into slavers, Galaza Galare told her, at the Temple of the Graces. And I am the calamity that will change these slavers back into people, Dany had sworn to herself. The last passage is especially important. When Galaza claims that Valyrian calamities caused her people to become slavers, Dany both links herself to Valyria and distances herself from it. She is also a Valyrian calamity, but this time she will turn them from slavers back into people. Daenerys finds strength and inspiration in her family members. Aegon's dragons were named for the gods of old Valyria, she told her blood riders one morning after a long night's journey. Visenya's dragon was Vhagar, Rhaenys had Meraxes, and Aegon rode Balerion, the Black Dread. It was said that Vhagar's breath was so hot that it could melt a knight's armor and cook the man inside, that Meraxes swallowed horses whole, and Balerion, his fire was as black as his scales, his wings so vast that whole towns were swallowed up in their shadow when he passed overhead. The Dothraki looked at her hatchlings uneasily. The largest of her three was shiny black, his scales slashed with streaks of vivid scarlet to match his wings and horns. Khaleesi, Aegon murmured. There sits Balerion, come again. The dragon has 3 heads, she cited. Do you know what that means, Jorah? Your Grace, the sigil of House Targaryen is a 3-headed dragon, red and black. I know that, but there are no 3-headed dragons. The 3 heads were Aegon and his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, she recalled. I am descendant from Aegon and Rhaenys through their son Aenys and their grandson Jaehaerys. 3 heads has the dragon, Dany thought, wondering. I shall tell my people to make ready to depart at once. But the ships that bring me home must bear different names. As you wish, said Arstan. What names would you prefer? Vhagar, Daenerys told him, Meraxes, and Balerion. Paint the names on their hulls, in golden letters 3 feet high, Arstan. I want every man who sees them to know the dragons are returned. The dragon has 3 heads. There are 2 men in the world who I can trust, if I can find them. I will not be alone then. We will be 3 against the world, like Aegon and his sisters. Though the Astapor yanked and tugged, Drogon would not budge off the litter. Smoke rose grey from his open jaws, and his long neck curled and straightened as he snapped at the slaver's face. "It is time to cross the Trident," Dany thought, as she wheeled and rode her silver back. Is this the face of a conqueror? So far as she could tell, she still looked like a little girl. No one was calling her Daenerys the Conqueror yet, but perhaps they would. Aegon the Conqueror had won Westeros with 3 dragons, but she had taken Meereen with 7 rats and a wooden cock in less than a day. Aegon the Conqueror brought fire and blood to Westeros, but afterward he gave them peace, prosperity and justice. Daenerys is favorably compared to the great people of her house, and contrasted against those who weren't all that good. "You are your brother's sister, in truth." "Viserys?" She did not understand. "No," he answered. "Rhaegar." Viserys was Mat Aerys' son, just so. Daenerys is quite different. The frightened child who sheltered in my manse died on the Dothraki Sea, and was reborn in blood and fire. This dragon queen who wears her name is a true Targaryen. Oft have I heard that yours is the blood of Aegon the Conqueror, Jaehaerys the Wise, and Daeron the Dragon. Daenerys Targaryen is no maid, however. She is a widow of a Dothraki Khal, a mother of dragons and saker of cities. Aegon the Conqueror with tits. In Fire and Blood, George R. R. Martin made sure to write callbacks to the main series. "A queen must listen to all," she reminded him. "The highborn and the low, the strong and the weak, the noble and the venal. One voice might speak you false, but in many there is always truth to be found." She had read that in a book. Above all else, a queen must know how to listen, Alysanne Targaryen often said. She is both. She is the culmination of all their hopes and dreams, and the defiance of these harmful cycles they perpetuated as a dynasty. And funnily enough, this isn't a theme only present in her character arc. It's the underlying theme of Jon's and Bran's characters as well. They both embody House Stark and fight against its crimes at the same time. Jon does it by letting the wildlings south of the wall, and Bran by seeking out the singers that his ancestors genocided. If Bran and Jon are not the antithesis of their house, then why would Daenerys be? If Jon and Bran don't have to die to redeem the sins of their family, why would Daenerys? And to know how the assimilation into Westerosi culture impacted their women in particular, it's important that it's a woman who breaks these cycles, and this is why it would be so anticlimactic for her to die on a man's sword, or to insinuate that Daenerys dying and thus extinguishing the dynasty is a necessary step for these cycles to be broken for good and for everyone. Because as we established before, Targaryens didn't bring feudalism, war, oppression and misogyny to the continent, and thus, this won't disappear once the last Targaryen dies. And besides, why would Daenerys be punished for the supposed rot that is not even her fault? It's Daenerys who had Targaryens' men feudal misogyny unleashed on herself tenfold. Rather than just being sold in marriage, her brother sells her into bridal slavery, claiming that he would let her be gang-raped by 40,000 Dothraki warlords, and their horses too, if it meant getting his way. Daenerys gets raped multiple times at 13, to the point that she's suicidal. At 14, she is pregnant, and again at 14, she suffers a painful, blood magic-induced stillbirth. Her and her baby suffering for the crimes of her husband. It is only after her father, her brothers, her husband and her son die that Daenerys is able to assert herself as a reigning queen, something actively denied to women such as Rhaena, Rhaenyra, Dana and others. But after all this, after her only sin is merely having a certain last name, after she is the one to bear the brunt of the worst done to Targaryen women, increased by tenfold, and actively breaking the curse, she has to die anyway as a tragic figure. This conclusion is disgusting even when you assume that the Targaryen's rot is inherent, and it becomes absurd when you take into account that Targaryen men's misogyny stems from their choice to assimilate into the dominant Andal culture of Westeros. So, she has to die for the sins of the patriarchy and misogyny of the Westerosi, yet nonetheless as a Targaryen, for whom these ways are by no means inherent. Is it because Daenerys dares to find strength and pride in her rotten heritage? Must be, even though she isn't the only one to do so. Much like Daenerys invokes the blood of the dragon, so do other characters find strength in their house symbolism. The wolf blood, Arya remembered now. "I will be as strong as Robb. I said I would." She took a deep breath, then lifted the broomstick in both hands and brought it down across her knee. It broke with a loud crack, and she threw the pieces aside. "I am a dire wolf, and done with wooden teeth." She would not give them pleasure of hearing her back. "I am Cersei of House Lannister, a Lion of the Rock, the rightful queen of these 7 kingdoms, true-born daughter of Tywin Lannister, and hair grows back." But if you believe that Targaryens and only Targaryens are inherently rotten, if you believe that dragons and fire are evil, then of course Daenerys finding strength in her heritage and embodying even its very best will be seen as a pathology. This is why it's so important to fight the very perception that there's something ontologically wrong with House Targaryen, and why I believe that distancing Dany from her family, even if done in good faith, is misguided. The primary reason why the Targaryens are hated are because Dany is a Targaryen, and with the release of Fire and Blood, this perception only increased, as it supposedly gave confirmation to the fact that there's something wrong with her on the basis of being a Targaryen. These two perceptions continue to influence each other in an endless vicious cycle. A dragon eating its own tail, if you will. Daenerys herself was and is the prime object of disdain based on all the things I mentioned. Daenerys was born in Westeros, but to a family that is seen as an outsider, an other in the first place, and spent the majority of her life on the eastern continent of the Eastern Order, associated with the things Western audiences will see as evil and rotten, fire and dragons. She cannot be separated from those, no matter how hard you argue, in favor of separating her from her family. And since even those who believe her to be that antithesis of her house want her dead on behalf of her last name, then we may as well embrace it. Daenerys is the best of her house and the defiance of the very worst. That is and has always been my thesis. It may be hard to fit these two ideas into your head, since they may seem incompatible at first, but that is what the text presents us with. Targaryens are not inherently rotten. They are simply different from other Westerosi houses, and their self-destruction does not come from them being different, but from them becoming more and more Westerosi as generations passed. Their crimes, past and present, are not unique to them. Ascribing inherent virtue or inherent rot to any house of Westeros means to flatten the nuances present within the story and engage in double standards. Enjoy them all, enjoy none of them, enjoy some and dislike others, fine by me, but ask yourself, from which underlying beliefs do your perceptions come? Do you single out only one of them as inherently evil and only perceive their crimes? And so, why do you do it? And please, recognize that feudalism, misogyny, oppression and war won't disappear with Daenerys dying and extinguishing the dynasty. Thanks for watching. Remember that if you like my content, like, subscribe and share, so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video. And remember, Phoenix rises from the ashes, and ashes always on top.